Welcome, Sarika. Welcome back. It's lovely to be here after a bit of a break and to continue where we left off the last time. Shall we maybe just start, as per our custom, with a little few moments of grace?
Absolutely. I heard both of us do a bit of a sigh as we got onto this recording. So, yeah, I think I'm just going to invite us to do three deep breaths this time, Rincha, and just maybe, yeah, arrive in the space and then let's get going. Yeah, I must say, as you know, based on where I'm at right now, even those deep breaths weren't helping ease the tightness in my chest based on my current personal circumstances. So I'm going to put that out there. I might need to take a couple of breaths as we go through this conversation as well. Thanks, Rensha. Yeah.
That's us, and that's real. That's the reality that we live in, and want to also share. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing a bit of your detail of the detail of that with me. And yeah, it remains here, and we will create space for whatever comes up as a result of our lives happening whilst we're shooting this. And maybe that's a nice way to start to go at the end
Mm.
of the last session. Life was happening to me as I was so engaged in the discussion. And I remember just seeing the time and going, oh my goodness, I have to leave. My daughter's going to be waiting for me. And yeah, that's the reality, right? We constantly confronted with this, trying to be in two places and trying to do two things well. And yeah, I think I want to call it a luxury, but I almost don't want to buy into it being a luxury to the reality that I think I'm choosing to create for myself is that one that I choose to prioritize also being a mom, and that yeah, make the choices of then doing the uncomfortable thing of saying we've got to end this now because I've got to go. And it, yeah, no one, as I said to my kids yesterday when it felt like there was a drama, no one died, no one got hurt, everything is okay, life goes on, and it all worked out. So yeah, thank you for also just accepting that and being with me when life happened and it impacted us.
Yeah, thanks, Rensha, for that, I think, intro into where we left off the last time. And I think, just as I reflect on it, I think the discomfort that I sat with around, oh my God, we're ending, wait, but there's still more. And just the kind of my own process and socialization, having come from corporate, reflecting on
Mm.
had I been corporate and needed to leave to fetch my child, and they were still busy with the important part of the discussion, I know many times I just sat there for the discussion and actually ended up picking up my son a bit later. Of course, he didn't know he was still at school and play school, and but I know. So I want to say I commend you, and I often talk about how you hold your boundaries firmly, and I guess just an invitation to other parents, other moms, other women to continue to work into that space despite the discomfort that we might experience. Good. So I think for today's conversation, what we wanted to do was really pick up on part two of that discussion because we both felt the
Mm.
need to kind of continue conversation around
Mm.
it. And the discussion was around International Women's Day and accelerating change towards gender equality or equity. Um, and so maybe just to kick us off into that conversation, what I thought we could do is just read a paragraph or two from the SDG, the UN United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, around Goal 5, and then maybe for us to use that as an into continuing our conversation. Yeah. So I'm reading this from the website, and we can put the link into once this podcast goes live. So it says gender equality is not only a fundamental human right, but a necessary foundation for peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. there has been progress over the last decades, but the world is not on track to achieve gender equality by 2030, which is, of course, the goal. Women and girls represent half of the world's population and therefore also half of its potential. But gender inequality persists everywhere and stagnates social progress. On average, women in the labor market still earn 23% less than men globally, and women spend about 3 times as many hours in unpaid domestic care work as men. And they go on to talk a little bit more about the different contexts around, violence, sexual exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. But I think maybe that is just a good point for us to kind of enter, because it's stuff that we talked about last time around the inequity around domestic tasks, and we talked about the work context and the pay gap. So your thoughts and reflections.
Thank you. Yeah. So thanks for bringing that into the room again. And I can feel again how I'm triggered when I read that. And so, but in reflecting on our last discussion, and what we covered, I was also kind of drawing on the word change and the need for change, which is actually, I think, what we want to stimulate here. And so that got me thinking about a little bit of my own and professional background as a change facilitator. And I love Glitch's formula for change that gives me a very simple formula to go, what do we need in order to overcome the natural resistance to change, which is the thing that holds us back. And his wisdom says there's 3 things that we need, that being a sufficient dissatisfaction with our status quo. Second thing is a clear vision or an ideal state, knowing what better looks like. And the third thing is then clarity on the first next steps that we need to take. Not necessarily all the steps, but at least the immediate steps. And I think if I reflect on our conversation the last time and I hear what you've just read in, I think we've done a fairly good job. We can always do more, but we've done a good job in connecting us with the dissatisfaction with the current status quo. And I also remember we did play a little bit about what would better look like in terms of specifically unpacking equity and not necessarily equal. And so I think that feels to me that I definitely have a need to go towards what are the actions, the actual tangible, small things, big things that we can and need to do in order to start creating that movement, the shift that we're so desperately wanting to see. So if that's, I don't know how that resonates with you. Are you happy that we focus most of our discussion around actions today?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. And I think, like we often do, is we have a couple of prompts and then we kind of go where the flow takes us, right? So I think it's a great space. And as you speak into that, I think about the research and also something you mentioned, which is, the levels at which we could explore that. And, we talked about maybe individual, organizational, and societal, which very much then relates back to the research. And I've got it in front of me today, so I'm prepared in case we need to reference that. So yeah, I think that's a good space. I think that's a great space for us to start.
And I love the 3 layers. And so intuitively, I'm thinking, why don't we start with the societal layer? Because selfishly, I want to end at the individual layer. Because sometimes if I do it the other way around, it feels like it's so big. So let's start with the big societal level shifts that we suggest we can and need to handle. And then we drill down to conclude with what can I do?
I'm happy to do that. And I want to say something because, I also have that change management background, and the change manager in me is kind of going, often we'll say to organizations don't change, individuals do. So I'm happy for us to start at society, provided that we've got that little caveat is that society is not a thing, it's a collective and it's made up of individuals. And so as we work our way back down, I'm happy to end with individuals, but to understand that it's that grouping of individuals that then create the organizational shift, and then that creates the societal shift. So happy to go there.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right. So at a societal level, what are the things that in your mind, the main things in your mind that can be influenced or can be changed that would create the shift towards greater equality for women and perhaps then working moms? Or yeah.
Yeah, Rensha, as I think of it, and obviously, this us ad-libbing, right? Um, the first thing that comes up for me is that it almost starts with how we rear children and families,
Mm.
you know, and it's a hard one to shift because if we look at how we've moved as a society, we've become a lot more westernized. We've become a lot more individualized. But some bits have gotten stuck, which we've talked about based on Ali Hochschild's book. And so if I had to go, well, okay, but how do I accelerate it there? Then for me, it's around little simple things. And I think I spoke a bit about this in part one as well, around almost raising a feminist son, you know, raising him in a family where he sees that equanimity between his dad and I, that he's seeing his dad do as much, of the care work as he sees me doing, of the earning work potentially. And I mean, even as I say it, I know it's almost bringing it down to family level again. So I'm holding that awareness because it feels like such a mesh. But that's kind of the first space that I went to is how do we do that and what are the things we do? So, for example, I said to you, my son loved cooking from a very young age and pretending that he was cleaning. So we've still got like a little kitchen type setup for him. And just this weekend, I mean, he's 8. He was playing that he was the restaurant manager and, doing the order on his iPad. So that was beautiful and preparing us something to eat. So that's the one level. I think the other level, when I think of societal, very clearly comes down to legislation and governance and that kind of stuff. And I think that's where, if we think of societal in the big sense of it, I think there's opportunity around our governments, the support that we get as parents. I mean, in America, they're trying to now, as you know, introduce a bit of a childcare fund that everybody who has a child gets a
Mhm.
fund as a minimum amount. A little bit like we have, social care for the elderly. I think just general legislation around maternity and paternity. Again, we've made progress, but I don't think we're there yet. In Europe, we've got paternity or parenting leave that basically can be split between the mother and father as they see fit, you know. So those are the kind of things that just pop into my head when you talk about it. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's anything for you
Very,
that kind of, yeah.
yeah, very, very much aligned. I think for me there was also the two buckets. I think there's the culture, and then I asked myself that how do we create culture shifts at a societal level? And for me, those are often through the media and through education. Storytelling, I believe, is a very powerful way of shifting perspectives and building new narratives. And that is what our media does, right? So yes, education, and I think we touched on this the last time too. Our school systems that does actually that are cultivating in them a greater awareness of gender stereotyping. And then I think I have also seen some influence in the media. If you think of, I mean, it's a silly example, but I think that this is reprogramming the youth and how they think about it. Is how Barbie, the Barbie, that was the stereotypical female, is now being represented with career options, and she's being positioned as an astronaut and a CEO and a scientist. And I think those are small examples, but those for me are very, very powerful new narratives that the media is helping instill to open or to rewrite perhaps previous belief systems around gender stereotyping. And yeah, so and I think there's a lot that can be done in that domain. And then I'm agreeing with you absolutely on legislation. And there it's quite interesting where I found that in the UK, they have now mandated companies to report on gender equity or not gender equity, on pay discrepancies. Which I thought was quite interesting. And then Iceland seemed to have taken it further, and they've actually made it illegal for companies to not pay them the same. And so, where companies there don't have a responsibility to report, which is really just the transparency that the UK has taken it, they've actually uh, uh, put a burden on them to prove that they are complying with that
Mm,
mandate. So again, this is not my favorite thing in the world to drive change through that.
yeah.
And I think it does send a very strong message. So yeah, those are examples of shifts that I think we could potentially consider. How could we adopt those, whether it's at a government level or perhaps within an organizational level, then whether it's mandated or not.
Mm,
Um, yeah, I think there's also, it's interesting. The other thing that popped up for me was making high quality childcare available at an affordable cost. And I know that there are companies like Denmark that are subsidizing that. And I'm a little bit conflicted about that because it also sometimes feels to me like we just think throw money at it and we undervalue the real complexity. It's not just the childcare. So yes, I do think it's part of the solution, but to me, there's more than that. And if I look at our South African context, then we compare it, for example, to what I'm seeing of my friends in Australia and New Zealand, our
yeah.
childcare is actually at a higher quality and more affordable than it is in a lot of the other countries.
Mm,
So yeah, there is an element for me in terms of how could we make that
mm,
um, yeah, more sustainable and support families to do
yeah.
both, not just women.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm very aware how we're weaving through. So we started societal, then you talk about organizational, we went to family. So I think we need to accept that we're not going to stick to one and
Yes,
we'll kind of move through
agreed.
it. What it triggered for me, I want to say inspired for me when you talked about the educational side is something simple as ballet classes being open to boys, the same way cricket and soccer is open to girls. So
Mm,
when I think of, my son was at the previous school and they offered ballet, and we'd learned from one of our friends who have very similar values and parenting style, where they said in terms of extracurricular, their son would do something, and I might get the categories wrong, but for his head, for his heart, for his body, and his mind. And we'd use a similar kind of approach, so there's a bit of yoga and whatever. And we just really wanted to help develop Mika's core. And I'd spoken to somebody who I knew, my ex Pilates instructor, and he said to me, listen, like gymnastics, or if not gymnastics, ballet. Um, and I remember saying it to Mika, and he didn't have a stereotype, but he held an awareness of the stereotype, you
okay,
know.
interesting.
Um, and then he told me about one young boy who did do ballet, but he was the only boy doing ballet. And then later we had a conversation, and in one of the terms, they actually brought in a male ballet teacher as
Mm,
opposed to a female one. And I thought, like, wow, like that's what I want, you
yeah,
know, that's what I want to be seeing when you think about
yeah,
education. And the same with, when you look at cricket teams and soccer teams, and again I reference, the school that he was in, and there'd be one girl on the school soccer team, or one girl on the school cricket team. And I'd like to start seeing that being like a real open mix of things, not to
yeah,
force kids, but that from an educational system that they're encouraging it in some
mm,
way.
yeah.
So that's just one thing that kind of triggered as you spoke into education and media. And I mean, we've spoken about media examples in previous podcasts, but I quickly thought, let me just remind myself what I wrote
Mm,
in terms of the research. And what I'd said in terms of as a society in general, there's a need to firstly recognize the shift over the past few decades in how, where, and when we live and work, and appreciate the changes in family roles and constructs and what is needed to support families in the light of these shifts. And here I think about affordable childcare, because we're no longer in those kind of communal spaces, and how we build that community of support.
mm,
So neighbors, lift clubs with parents in similar, kind of situations. And I know this feels like something one physically needs to organize, but one of the things I have a huge need and desire for is other parents coming together, just having conversations proactively, and I don't
mm,
want it to feel like support group necessarily,
yes.
but just kind of us as parents making a commitment and say we get together once a month and we talk about, what are the topics with our kids' lives, and we learn from one another. So that's one of the
Mm,
like I think very simple actions we can take at a societal level. The other one was to refocus to ensure that these shifts are reflected in how we consider both support for parents. I think that's an
Mhm.
example of that. And then I think that lobbying for change,
Yeah.
you know, for change in legislation, policy, and governance, as well as more systemic solutions that are focused on supporting families. And whether
Mhm.
that's through grants, whether that's through funding, whether that's through government-led, care institutions. And again, I think of the disparities in society, and particularly in our South African society, which again we've spoken about. You and I belong to a very similar economic group and standing. People, other moms who work in more informal spaces, in domestic work, or that kind of stuff, have the same needs, maybe to a different level, but have the same needs for childcare. In fact, theirs probably surpass ours in terms of the amount of hours, because often they're leaving really early in the morning, so
Correct.
I don't have the answer, but this is sitting with me. And then I think the last thing, and this was the one that touched on media, that said ensure and lobby for countries' media marketing and advertising, depicting motherhood and parenting to represent more equitable portrayals of the distribution of earner and nurturer roles, so as to not perpetuate the gender stereotype. And again, I think of adverts wherever there's a care role or dropping the kids at school role, and who are we seeing? And I almost want to say how that has an effect on us, because if I name any song to you from whatever, like, generally, if it's something you've often heard on the radio, even if it's an artist you don't listen to, you're going to remember the tune, you're going to remember the song. You may not
Yeah.
remember who sung it and all of that. It's
Mm.
the same thing, that every time we watch TV and we see the mom, or the soccer mom, as it's sometimes termed,
Mhm.
every time we see the mom in the vapor rub
Mhm.
advert or in the child is sick advert and it's the mom, that in itself is almost feeding subliminally messages to our brain, you know. And so I do think those kind of shifts will definitely support us in almost subconsciously integrating this into our brains. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I think so it's not about not portraying that, but it's also about portraying the dads in those roles and to portray the moms in the professional roles. So, yes, to show the professional women that are the leader or the owner of a business, and to show the dad also supporting the kids. So it's not a either or, it's a both. And I
Yeah.
think that's for me is what is required. Because often, and I think earlier when you spoke about raising your son as a feminist, I remember last time also I was a little bit triggered by that because of this my association with it. I know that that's not your heart behind it. To
Mm.
go, it's women versus men.
Mm.
It is just about sometimes in order to correct an imbalance, we need to kind of emphasize the one before we can a little bit more before we can reach that equilibrium. And I think that's where we ultimately want to settle. And so, yeah, that's how I know you to also be in that space. But my word association with feminism is not that. So
You're not alone. And I think I said it in the last recording where I said even that I had such a struggle with, because often when I think of feminism, I think of bra burning, kind of, that kind of approach. And even that is how it's been sold to us by a very male dominated, constructed society, right? And I'm going, my definition of feminism is around gender parity and gender equanimity. That's my version of it. And that means accelerating some of that stuff until that kind of balance starts to exist. So yeah, absolutely. And I struggled with it. I even struggled with it when doing my research, because I remember one of the research advisors saying to me, "Why are you not taking a feminist kind of approach to your research and your literature?" And I went, "Because I don't want to make an assumption that that's where it starts. I want to go into this." And as I did and explored and had the conversations, there it was. I couldn't ignore it, you know. So I'm glad that you bring it up, because I do think part of what we need to do is shift the thinking around what feminism actually is versus what it was. Yeah.
And then I want to come back to something else you mentioned. So for me and my structured brain, it sits within the organizational level. You're right, it doesn't matter as long as we cover it all at the end of the day. And that's the kind of organization's ability to create influence through their policies. And so, yeah, I think you mentioned some leave policies that have changed. And again, I was actually encouraged when I started looking around at how not only internationally there have been great shifts, but actually also locally. And I think the one that I found that is really, really leading the way, there might be others, forgive me if I didn't find them, but the one that I found was Vodacom, that have not only given or extended leave, full paid leave, but they've also given 16 weeks, if I remember correctly, 16 weeks that the partner of the one that is the primary caregiver or that gave birth, 16 weeks that they can take any time within their first 18 months of that child's life. And I just love that because I think the reality is often mom is on maternity leave because, yes, probably biologically she had to be, and then she's the one getting it. But then when she goes back to work, how amazing could it be if dad can then take his 16 weeks with baby? And what would that do to the dynamic of the relationship and the home of that? Just, I think that's amazing. And then I think what they added to that was upon returning from parental leave, which means whether it's the mom or the dad or the primary caregiver and the partner, because it is gender neutral, and they were very specific about that too, they also have the option of starting integrating back in a 30-week full pay or 30 hours a week on full pay. Which again, I think that's just that sensitivity towards integrating back into the workplace once after you've been through that transition. I think is quite incredible. And so, yeah, the last thing I want to add to that is I do think so. There's the leave policies, but then there's practice of actually being conscious of and having back to work programs, integration programs, and whether that consists of coaching or support groups within the system, or just an awareness that I'm not getting the same person back that I've said goodbye to when they went on maternity leave.
Nail on the
We
head.
are the most powerful changes that organizations can make. And it doesn't have to always cost money. It can really just be time and the intention to be conscious about it and to create space to hold conversations around what does this mean and how do we
Yeah,
want to coexist in this new phase of your life.
yeah, yeah. There's so much I want to say there. So my thoughts are not as organized and structured as yours, as we know. So I'm going to try and catch all of them. The first one is I'm very blessed to have worked for that red and white company at a point in my career. And I want to say that they've always been ahead of the curve. It's something I really appreciated. And I worked in the HR space while I was there, and they've really been ahead of the curve. I think they have an amazing leadership, and they continue to have an amazing leadership that really focuses on that. And yeah, I mean, ahead of the curve. When I think of them, always ahead of curve is what comes to mind. I didn't know about the latest shift, and I think it doesn't surprise me. Like I say, they've always been sort of operating more at a global level in terms of their people practices. I think that's fabulous, and I think definitely more companies can take a page out of that book. Um, and then I want to say my own personal experience is with one of the massive retailers, as you know. And I was in a very fortunate position. And again, the policies differ. And I think that's part of what I'm trying to also allude to is that you don't always have to go full hog. A company like you spoke about might have the kind of financial backing to be able to do that, to offer to everybody, irrespective of level. The company I'm now talking about, I often say retail is the poor cousin of corporate. And so it isn't available necessarily to everybody. But what I had at the level that I was at, and I had an amazing leader at the time. I remember I was so scared to mention to my leader that I was pregnant because we just had an org structure change, and and all kinds of things was going on. And he physically jumped out of his seat and came to give me a hug, and I went, "What?"
Mm.
And then I had this amazing offer of 6 months fully paid maternity leave. and then the opportunity to reintegrate, with some level of flexibility, which wasn't policied. That
Mm.
second part wasn't policied,
Wow. Mm.
but it was how he managed me as an individual employee, which I was super appreciative for.
Mm.
Um, there is a policy in that organization that exists that allows any employee, even the employees working in the retail stores at the time that I was there, which was already a couple of years ago, up to a year
Sure.
maternity leave on a sliding scale with a
Mm.
percentage of pay. And a lot of the women, um, take that up. And then also, I think in the last few years, they've also really come on board in terms of paternity leave. And I know that they've increased that. So I think, that's another example of companies really, really stepping up and leading the way, which is really awesome. Um, Something else that came up, and again, I'm looking down because I'm referring to the research around what I put out there, and I think we talked about the more egalitarian policies and practices, which I think this is an example of. The leave is an example of, and then you talked about you not getting the same person back, and I know you and I, the dream is to work in these corporates, if you're listening, to be able to run these kind of coaching programs for reintegration, not just for moms, but for parents. People often call it maternity coaching, but it's not around the maternity period. It's around the once baby's born and I've had my time off and I'm reintegrating into work. Um, you know, that's when we need the support because I'm not the same person that I used to be. So I think that support there around once people become parents, um, and recognizing the prominence of that parenting role, how that becomes front and center.
Mm.
So Bob might have in the past happily stayed when meetings ran over, but Bob's not in the same situation anymore, you
Mm.
know, or the same for Mary. And I think to expect that and also coach leaders around if they've got people in their team, and to help those conversations proactively. Um, I kind of had put in very practically also the training of line managers around the implementations of policies and practices, because often you'll get people who go, this is the policy and be a stickler for it. And in my experience, I had a line manager when the policy says up to 6 months, and I'm agreeing with you that post those 6 months, you can integrate at pace. So
Mm.
I think there's the policy and there's the practice. And I think line managers having the autonomy to be able to work within the confines of those in a way that makes sense for that employee based on their needs. Because again, each employee's needs might be different, based on their sort of family structure and situation. Um, and then I think the last one is one that's maybe not so common. It was really talking about integrating, helping, parents, new parents, and mothers in particular, integrating into their new roles better. So, for example, offering on-site early childhood care facilities
Mhm.
where moms can still go pop out and breastfeed their kids. You know, I know lots of organizations are now creating private rooms where women can pump breast milk.
Mhm.
So I think that's a great thing. But I think ultimately it's around ensuring a closer proximity, physical proximity of parent and child. I think
Mhm.
it's maximizing the time that they have available, especially during those early childhood development stage. Um, and I remember discussing with one of the supervisors on my program, because obviously the program was one of those, as you know, where you really have to think out the box. And he said to me, he went, so what do you have as ideas that maybe, people haven't thought of? And I know we came up with this thought of, well, what if these early childhood centers were not run by child care workers, but were actually manned by the employees whose kids were actually
Mm.
in that center to start with?
Mm.
So from a cost perspective for the employer, there's not an additional cost. If you've got a room and you just do it up, there's a facility, but then parents get scheduled and you almost integrate the parenting role and the employee role. So
Mm.
maybe if you and I were involved in that and our kids were in that care center, you'd be there from 9 to 10 and I'd go in from 10 to 11. You need
Yeah.
to think through the practicalities, you might need some overlap, etc. But what a beautiful way of creating community and support and just allowing kids and parents to flourish, you
Mm.
know. So that kind of really pops out for me, something very
Yeah.
pragmatic. And I'd love to be able to trial something like that with an organization,
Mm.
and to see what the ROI and the
Yeah.
benefits are.
Absolutely. It's weird. I'm sitting listening to you, and I think there's two parts of me. There's the human that goes, yeah, I've done that actually in my own small little world. And that friend of mine who was also working from home during school holidays, she would come to my house, and we would just look at our diaries and going, okay, you're on child duty between 8 and 10. Then I've got a meeting. I move into the room. She sits outside on the laptop watching them with swimming pool. So yeah, and in a very small practical way, we do this outside of corporate. And then when the other part of me listened to that with my old HR hats on, and I can just see problems and how challenging and how difficult that can be. And that's where I want to challenge myself to go. I really think there's a possibility of us playing with ideas like that. And so how can it be different? And yeah, because yeah, it is. I
Yeah.
mean, at the end of the day, that the word that you're using is about integrating these different
Yes.
roles. And I think that's ultimately where my heart is also at. It's not about
Yes.
balancing them, it is about
No.
integrating them. And at the moment, we're still trying to create solutions in the workplace context that tries to keep them separate. And that's why I think there will always be strain until we get
Yeah.
to a place where it is truly integrated, which feels a
Yeah.
lot more flowy
Yeah.
and possible.
Yeah. I want to respond because it's sitting with me, when you said you noticed the resistance, and obviously as an HR practitioner myself, you know, I also kind of go, yeah, I understand. And I think sometimes we make them out to more than they need to be, right? Because in my mind, it's fairly simple, but maybe not simplistic. So you need a physical venue, you need the room to be childproof. I'm talking particularly early, you need
Yeah.
somebody who's definitely got, first aid and some childcare background. And if you're using the parents, then all you need to do is get first aid training. And often organizations offer that
Do
already.
that in any way, yeah.
I think the biggest thing you need is a open, flexible mindset around the shift,
Correct. Absolutely. You're right.
around
And yeah, it's
the value that you're getting as an employer and you don't need to
okay.
commit to it forever. You run it as a trial, you do it for a couple of months, you reevaluate it, you either then go, we tried and it didn't work, we tried, this is what we learned, and this is what we can offer thereafter. But I
Yeah.
think Yoda said it best: do or do not, there is no try. And I think often what we do is we get
Mm,
stuck in trying to figure it out in our heads as opposed to going, let's just try. Let's
yeah.
just try and let's learn, and I
Yeah.
really, this is my appeal to organizations out there. Try, you know,
Try.
give it a shot
Yeah. You're right,
and do it,
Sarika. And I think, yeah. And you
sorry,
know what,
Rachel, that's the one thing.
sometimes, no, no, you go.
Sorry for talking so
Finish
long.
your thought.
But
Sorry.
the one thing I do want to say on that try, the caveat is I understand and appreciate the legal implications around, and I get
Correct.
that. And I'm saying do it together. So part of social entrepreneurship and innovation is do it with the people. And I think if you do it with the people that you're working with, then there's some leeway for going, we know that this is what they recommend and this is what we're able to offer. Can we do this together? So I do want to say I understand the parameters and the constraints, and I'm going, I don't see them as major constraints in that way.
Mm.
Sorry, and you were trying to say something.
No, 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 no. You just apologies for speaking over you there. You just there's so many thoughts that you're triggering me. And then
Mm.
I think the one that came up for me is sometimes our crises allow us opportunities to test things that we previously wouldn't have thought possible. And again, that gets me on a completely different topic, which is also some of the solutions around flexible working and working from home and all of that. And I know that's been something that I've been passionate about for years. And so for me, COVID was the best thing ever because all the resistance I've got from companies for decades where I've tried to implement it suddenly just disappeared because of the need that COVID created. And I think so sometimes in this, if I think of micro examples where I did have a meeting that I couldn't attend and I had to go and my child was sick, where I go, today my child's going to just have to come with me. It's not ideal. I know it's unprofessional, but it's either that or the meeting ain't happening, and that's not an option. So he has to come with me, and we made it work. And that brought to mind for me, I think, an example I saw of that New Zealand Prime Minister. What is her?
Yes,
Um,
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you. Yes, I forgot her name for a moment. Where she took, and I don't know if it was a crisis, but I think the move that she made was quite bold. The statement that I took from it is that leadership and motherhood can coexist, where she took her child to the General Assembly, the US, UK, UN General Assembly. And yeah, that's it, and it can happen. It's possible. Yes, you might not want to have it there all the time, and at a certain age, it's going to become disruptive, but it can happen. And so, yes, I think it's about maybe taking our crises and creating short-term solutions and then asking ourselves, is this a possibility and how could this work for others to shift us out of our current stuck way of thinking?
Yeah, yeah. And you're triggering for me, and we're going to jump around and we might talk over each other, but you're triggering for me the US that had offered free childcare during the election so people can go vote. And I think, well, what, to do that in South Africa, especially for people in rural areas, that travel long distances, like how do we think about these solutions? And it doesn't have to be government coming up with all of it. It can be the political parties. It can be, whatever. So I mean, that's another example that comes up for me. And then the Olympics, where I can't remember who it was, but had asked for an adjoining room so that they could breastfeed their child and childcare at the Olympics. And like I just go, yeah, psh, exactly. And as I say it, I'm going, and all of this in terms of how it was reported in the media was support for moms.
Yep.
And I'd love to hear that being shifted as and sold as support for parents, right? And even as I say that, I go, yeah, but Sarika, your guys' stuff is called the Motherhood, and your podcast is called the Motherhood Diaries. And yes, and I think we acknowledge dads, we acknowledge the partnership, we acknowledge their role, and I think the reason we're focusing there is a part of accelerating that change. You know, so yeah, so those things really inspired and kicked in for me when you were talking around pragmatic, practical things that can be done. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it does then end me with, because all of these, whether we're talking societal or organizational level, these are all changes that are being driven by some individual that perhaps have a seat at a societal level or have a seat at an organizational level, like both of us have influenced HR policies around these things. And then, yeah, I think then there are also, I guess, just some individual mind shifts that I want to keep challenging myself and others that I work with. And I think something very practical I've seen is how mothers still, when they're putting their CVs together,
Yeah.
still have a bit of shame and try to hide that gap that they perhaps took because they chose to be a primary caregiver. And that for me is something that I want to challenge and go, can we not hide it? Can we actually broadcast it, be proud of it, and instead focus on the transferable skills that we've learned in that season that makes us now almost worth more because of what we bring based on this experience, instead of being shameful about that decision
Yeah.
we take. And so it's an individual mindset that makes me show up differently, but that will, I believe, have a ripple effect into organizations and how they perceive it.
Yeah. Yes. And I want to say, I'm pretty sure it's LinkedIn that has a thing now where you can actually, when you say you've taken a gap, I think you can actually say what you've done, and you can say, a childcare gap or something like that. So
Correct.
those are some of the positive shifts. I think before we delve deeper into the individual level, there was something that we prepped, or I'd put into the notes, when we were prepping for the part one of this conversation. And I want to read it because it's a quote from Margaret Mead, and I don't think I got to it because we're getting to the individual level. But her quote said, "Never underestimate the power of a small group of committed individuals to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has." And I think as we move maybe deeper and more consciously into the individual level to talk about the organizational and societal level about these groups of people. So if you're listening to us and you're trying to bring about some change in some kind of community or societal space or in your organization, then I think rally together. I think that's a big thing. And you and I have talked about this in our sideline conversations the other day, where or you might have even done it on the podcast, where you said it's not my problem to solve. It might feel like it's my problem to solve.
Mm.
But I think looking up and looking out and go, who else around me can help me solve this problem? So I just wanted to close that there. And I think, in terms
Mm.
of the individual level venture, what comes up for me is, and I might be jumping ahead to where you might have gone, but is the mothers or mothers and then partners, or
Mm.
if you're in same sex relationships, primary caregiver and then partner. And I think we want to ease that load and that burden. And the reality is sometimes we're going to have to be those instigators of the change, you know. And I think pragmatically, some of the things that I find you and I doing. And so somehow we've got a bit of a community here, you and I, because we hold each other accountable and we recognize each other. And I go over and share, wow, you've held your boundary so great there. And you go, hey, Sarika, well, and I think just those conversations are alive with me, even when we're not together or not in conversation. And like I said to you in our kind of pre-conversation today, I had a really challenging couple of days in terms of childcare, transport, school situation, playground dynamic. And I found myself living through it and this wise kind of self
Mm.
observing me living through it, you know, which has helped me almost respond. And we talked last time about the responsibility in one of our podcasts,
Mm.
but I think has seen me in a situation where I am able to respond from a space of conscious awareness,
Yeah.
as opposed to react, you know.
Mm.
So I just want to say what some of those things. Sorry, go ahead.
No,
Go.
no, 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 no. I want to underline that, but I'll come back to it later. You
No,
continue.
underline because I'm going to read. So underline, please
Okay.
do.
So no, I think so. For me, there's a theme of noticing and then speaking up because a lot of this change, and I can cite some examples later, but a lot of the change needs to be, okay, I'm noticing it. It does not resonate with me. It's not aligned with what it should be. But then we have a responsibility to speak up or ask at least ask what we would ideally want. And how we do that, I think, is extremely important. If we do it from a place of reacting, then I don't think we're going to have an impact. But if we can do it from a place of responding appropriately, responding to the injustice in a non-confrontational, non-aggressive manner, I think we have a much greater uh, chance of actually creating a shift or getting people in a space to be open to receive what we're offering,
Mm,
whether it is a request to change or to give us something that we previously didn't have, but the how we do it, I think, is
yeah.
extremely important.
Yeah. And I think as you say that, what comes up for me is there's a yes and that yes and for me is sometimes that's available to me and sometimes it's not. So
Mm.
sometimes I react and I lose my you know what, and that's okay
Yeah.
because there's not this perfect parenting. I mean, and I think that's really important that we share that, is often when we sit here, we reflect on how things are, and I'm holding an awareness of how it might come across as, yeah, we've got this so worked out and we're so calm and oh my God. A couple of
Mm.
days ago, I mean, I shared with you and I really, it was not an easy situation. And I lose my cool, right? And I'm also holding
Mm.
an awareness around how they double standard. So if we lose our cool as women, how sometimes it's named something different, you know. So, we're not necessarily saying don't lose your cool, but we also know that effective kind of resolution often comes
Right.
from a response as versus a reaction. So just to put that
Yeah.
out there. Yeah, I just want to remind myself of, what kind of had come up at that point. And from a mother's perspective, what I suggested is engaging in honest conversations about the experiences of motherhood. And this is it, the
Yeah.
unfiltered chronicles of real life moms, and
Mhm.
and I think that's really, really important. Um, I think talking about the challenges, as well as the wins, and then also sharing sort of what worked, what didn't, and allowing for different parenting styles and allowing for different approaches, as long as it's not hurting you or the child physically or in any other way. I think us allowing space for going, oh, you guys do that differently, and that's okay. That works for your family. Again, I think of this family that I mentioned before, where they talk about different families, different rules, and we've used that, to kind of help our son understand our family values, versus other families. And it's not a right or wrong. And then I think recognizing, acknowledging our decreased focus on ourselves. I think talking into it. I mean, earlier when we started, you said, "Oh, Sariko, you look amazing, your hair," and I was like, "Rencha, it's just clean hair." And let me tell you what a difference clean hair makes to me when I'm in the space that I was in. And I mean, I'm not ashamed to share it. It had been 10 days since I last washed my hair because life was happening. And just somehow having clean hair just makes me feel like I can deal again, you
Yeah.
know. So I think just holding that awareness, talking about it, not going, oh yeah, I'm gonna wash your hair for 10 days, but going like, I've been there, you know. Sorry, funny moment, but I forgot to change my underwear for the last 2 days. Like, early, like I haven't showered for the last 3 days because all I've been doing is, I'm a feeding station for my child. So I think allowing that space and not ostracizing women or not kind of going, it's okay,
Yeah.
you're there and you're not alone. So I think there's that. Um, and then I think this is important, is understanding that invisible hierarchy that I talked about in the literature around how we tend to put child first, partner, work, family, whatever, and then, we're kind of at the
Mm.
bottom of that hierarchy. I think again that we're not alone in this intensive mothering, that we're expecting of ourselves or others expect of us. And I think the last thing was expecting and then also learning to trust our partners. And this is a big one. Expecting
Mm.
and learning to trust our partners as equally competent in the
Yeah.
home and childcare space.
Yeah.
And even as I say that, you and I have had these conversations around how we would rather just do it ourselves, or they
Mm.
don't do it our standard and our level. So I do think there's some work for us there as the
Yeah.
mom. I'm going to pause
Correct.
there before I talk about
Yeah.
partners.
No, you're spot on. And I must say on that note, it's becoming easier for me as the kids are getting older. Um, but I know that to me, when they were very, very small, and kind of basic survival needs was at play, that was very real for me, and that I needed to sometimes hold myself back to go. It's not how I would have done it, but the child is okay. No one was hurt, no one was killed, so
Yeah.
yeah. And so yeah, absolutely. And I think that also is I think an important part of justice and fairness too, and to get to the point of equality. I think that's an amazing point to raise. You want to get to partners. There's one more point that I want to make just in terms
Mm.
of supporting women. So before you go there, I think you
Mm.
touched on something around not giving each other a hard time and not judging each other. And I absolutely think for me that is one of the most significant, very, very practical things that we can do, is to get real with each other and to
Mm.
support each other. And whether it's in the workplace or whether it's in our inner rooms or whether it's in our family systems, but to actually lift each other up, to encourage each other and to acknowledge each other for the moves that we see each other make towards that greater future. And I think there again, I can't wait to invite Claire onto a
Mm.
podcast with us, because she to me is just such an amazing example of how she has also, through her own trauma and her own struggles, looked at her workplace and go, what needs to shift? And no, I might not have the mandated power, but by speaking up and influencing and taking opportunities that I have, she has installed amazing shifts in a very corporate, very not in a corporate, in a government system, which is traditionally known not to change. And so, yeah, and that comes from actually encouraging. And the more we encourage each other, the more we fill each other with courage. I love the word encourage. We're really giving each other
Yeah.
courage to speak up more. And the more we speak up in a non aggressive manner, the more influence we can have. And
Mm.
that, yeah, I think is what the least we can do to each other, for each other,
Mhm.
is to
Yeah,
just keep lifting each other up.
yeah, yeah,
And
absolutely. And I mean,
the
sorry, go
part,
ahead.
no, no, no. I just wanted to invite you to come back to the partners where you were going.
Yeah, yeah. I do want to say two things before I get to partners, and then I know we need to move to close. But I think the one is you've mentioned Claire, and I think absolutely, Claire's just an everyday mom, guys, like you and I. And so definitely we're looking at getting her and maybe one or two of her colleagues onto a podcast. Um, but I think the other thing I wanted to say is around mothers, but also the responsibility we take for our kids. And like, you said when they're young. And I think when they're young, it's like, are they like fed, like what's going on? But one of the things we do, and this is a practical thing, is we often ask it off Mika. Do you feel safe? Do you feel happy? And do you feel loved? And actually, as you were speaking, you said, as the kids grow, and I thought, I don't need to ask it of him all the time, but I could ask it of myself when I'm putting pressure on myself. Right now, is my child safe? Is he happy? And is he feeling loved? And if the answers to that are yes, irrespective of the fact that I made fried eggs for dinner, so easing that pressure so there's a tip maybe we could
Love that.
use. Um, yeah, and then Rinsha, I think just on the mothers and partners or primary partners and secondary, or primary carers and partners. I think what I indicated is really the importance of ongoing dialogue, ongoing and open dialogue. And it's so hard. I mean, Mike and I were in a situation yesterday where we were starting to pull apart a little bit. And I reminded him and I went, babe, like, please, can we just do this together? And he goes, but I feel like you're attacking me. And I said, I don't mean it like as an attack on you. I'm just understand my stress. This is not about you, it's about the situation. And we really have to have that conversation. It was so much easier again to react in that conversation. And we had a few moments of that. We had a few moments of me throwing at him and him throwing at me accusations,
Mm.
or you call it what you want. and and we managed to. And so I'm not saying that won't happen, but so that eventually where you get to is a space of like, okay, we've gotten that out. Let's figure it out together. And we did, and he stood up and he picked up some stuff and I picked up some stuff, and then we were able to appreciate each other for what we picked up. So I think that ongoing dialogue, ongoing, guys, it doesn't end. Doesn't matter how old the kids get, it doesn't end, right? Um, but I think that the points there's around understanding individual expectations and contributions, to the relationship, whether it's earn and nurture, whether it's who picks and drops, whether, whatever it is, understanding those roles, and talking about them proactively. I think the second one was about exploring new ways and opportunities for support and closer collaboration with a greater shared accountability. And I think here it's important. I know in the research, some of the moms are saying, I never really thought of that. But maybe for me and my partner to sit down and go, who is our support network? Who is the go-to person in an absolute emergency? If we had to drop Mika off, who are the top three people that we're going to drop him off with? If there's an emergency at school and we can't get there, who's the like do it up front so that you guys are aligned, and when it happens, you've got a plan.
Yeah.
And talk to your child about the plan,
Yeah.
so that they're aware that if ever it comes up, you've got this. Who's our babysitting circle? Who are
Mm.
families who we share values with that we want to proactively spend more time with. So I think it's important to
Mm.
have these conversations. And then I think the last one was it was the same thing, recognizing and identifying jointly this ecosystem of support and
Mm.
contracting with those individuals, letting them know that they're your go-to people, letting them know, hey guys, you're a family we really resonate with from a values perspective. Can we proactively look at opportunities for play dates or shared kind of babysitting, or whatever the thing is? So yeah,
Yeah.
that's probably the last thing I want to say. And I'm not sure if you've got any thoughts, ideas that come
Mm.
up for you before we go to close on our podcast for today.
No, just to thank you, because actually that has triggered in me, again, just to go out of sometimes what feels like a crisis is opportunity, and to spot that. So just yesterday, actually, a couple that we know down the road reached out to us to go, or husband is in Joburg next week. They don't have transport for the child. Can she drive with us? And it never even crossed my mind. They stay less than a kilometer from us, and we both drive in the same direction every morning. We can't do pickup because the kids come out at the same time. And I'm going, absolutely, let your child drive with me tomorrow morning. But I'm thinking, why don't we do something more regular to go, can we take turns? And yeah, so just let's open ourselves to go, how can we widen that circle of a
Yeah,
support network, and giving ourselves permission to do that, which I
yeah,
think is the
yeah.
other.
I want to say I'm so delighted that that came up for you because I know you and I have had the conversation of I need to go, I need to drop my kids, I need to.
Yeah.
And I also want to say I'm with you because I'm not that parent. And even as I say that parent, I go, well, is that a judgment? I'm going, no, but actually, that's not my natural space to go, oh, let's do this. But we had a family when we were at the other school who approached us and said, hey, guys, do you want to do Lift Club? And we did, we ended up doing it. It was such a huge relief, you know,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
strain off us.
For
So,
both.
so
Yeah.
absolutely encourage that. And definitely feeling the effect of not having that with Mika now going to the school that's so far away and nobody else going from this area. So appreciating it from both sides. Rachel, I think, we're almost at the hour. So as we bring this to a close, I think, two things I'd like for us to do. One is I'm going to read out some of those suggested ways that we can act that are on that website of the United Nations SDG goals. And we can, like I said, we'll put that link up. But I think for you and I, after we've read that, just to take a moment to pause and go, well, what's the one thing we're taking away from this? The same way we encourage our listeners to kind of
Mm.
go, what's the one thing, and particularly actionable thing? If you think of coaching and shifting and making a change, one actionable thing, that we could do. Um, so I'm just going to read out what it says here under what we can do on this page. It says, if you're a girl, you can stay in school, help empower your female classmates to do the same, and fight for your right and access to various things. I mean, and they particularly call out sexual and reproductive health services because that's obviously a big thing in the world. But I think generally for equal rights. If you're a woman, you can address unconscious biases and implicit associations that form an unintended and often an invisible barrier to equal opportunity. And I think we've talked about some of that today. And I love this part. If you're a man or a boy, you can work alongside women and girls to achieve gender equality, and we talk about equity, and embrace healthy, respectful relationships. And I think that's such a beautiful way to encourage all of us at an
Mm.
individual level to be able to bring about some shift. So with
Mm.
that, Rachel, we've covered a lot of stuff today, and it's felt
Mm.
so beautiful. And I'm so grateful for the space to continue this conversation from last episode. So your reflection or call to action for yourself.
Yeah. So, Rika, as I fell into that, I think for me it's actually interesting how intuitively I noticed I might have started doing it, but I didn't consciously realize it. I know there's a for me a part of modeling it, modeling it, and also I think the theme of allowing myself permission to create the life that I want to have. And so I think there was a season in my professional journey where I did put my boundaries down, but because I was still struggling with allowing myself to prioritize my kids as an equal part of my life, I would very deliberately just communicate, sorry, I'm not available to some of my clients. And I would specifically not try and over explain, I'm sorry, I'm not available because my daughter's got I couldn't go there because I was just playing with, sorry, I'm not available, because they would accept it if they knew I had another client, but why wouldn't they accept it? So that's how I kind of were able to do it for a very long time. And recently, I've actually felt the need to start becoming more transparent about what am I prioritizing in my life. And so now, these days, especially where I have a relationship with those clients, I'm a lot bolder to go, I'm sorry, I cannot take that meeting because that is the time where I am driving my kids around, and that's why I'm not available.
Mm.
And so I want to continue doing that, but more so, I also want to start calling out and acknowledging people that I honor them and I consider them when they do the same thing. And this is specifically then, I think I had the opportunity yesterday, and then I didn't again consciously realize where I did that, where we were trying to find a meeting time, and I'm going, I can't do that hour because I'm driving. Father, I know you can't do 8:30 in the morning because you're doing drop-off lift duty, and I want to honor that. Can we settle at a 9 o'clock in the morning?
Mm.
And in that way, also encouraging and giving them the same permission that I've given myself to go, that's okay. And so that's something that I want to start doing, modeling it and encouraging it where I'm seeing it in others to make it the norm and not the
Yeah,
exception.
yeah,
Back
yeah.
to integrating it, not balancing it.
Right, right. As you speak, and particularly because you said, it was the father, you and I share an accountant in common. And we have a lunch meeting, and I got a message from him yesterday. So the lunch meeting's for tomorrow, and I got a message from him yesterday going, my daughter's coming out of school early. Is there any chance, and would it be convenient for you to move our meeting, a bit earlier? And, I mean, I don't want to say it's convenient, it's a little bit less convenient. However, as I had that initial kind of thing come up in me, and I went, and here's a dad, just like us moms trying to maintain a boundary and a commitment to his child. And actually, my heart then smiled and I said, absolutely, come at 11. So I want to acknowledge that and thank you for bringing that into my awareness. Sure, Ranger. I feel like we spoke about so much. And I need a moment. So
Mm.
um, I think when I reflect on action, accelerating action towards change, I think if I were to frame for me what I'd like to do, I think on an individual level, for me, you talked about modeling, but I think for me, it's really around my relationship with Mike and us as parents. And I think creating those spaces very consciously and very deliberately to have conversations because it's so easy. And we've experienced this. It's so easy to get into you're jumping into bed at night and you're like, did you do this? Am I picking up? Did you fetch? Or is he doing cricket? Is he doing and like and then it's so easy to kind of get at loggerheads and go like you didn't and I did last week and we get there, we all get there. So my commitment on an individual level is to ensure that I hold that accountability and I contract with him to hold that accountability because there'll be days where I'm the one whining and binging and had enough and where I might need him to go to me, hey, we're in this together. I appreciate and I can see where you're at right now, but let's just find a way together. So I think that's the individual thing for me. Um, I think organizationally for me, it's still to kind of prod my clients and encourage them and show up as I am going, I can't do that because actually they know, most of them know after 3 o'clock I'm not available every day. And on Fridays, I generally don't do meetings. And yes, it's true. It's how I'm living my life. And I know it's people might say it's a privilege, but it's a privilege I've worked hard for and I earn and I maintain. Um, but yeah, it's showing up in that way because I think it allows others the permission or encourages and inspires others to be able to go, oh, well, let me try it, let me play with that. So I think that for me is in the organizational space. And ultimately, the dream is still to partner with organizations who want to offer these kind of things to their employees and to coach or to advise in that space and putting that intent out there and that action. And then I think the societal one for me is to continue to speak into injustice when I see it happening, even if it's subliminal or unconscious or whatever, like I've done, when we see these things. And I mean, and I'll continue to do. And I think if I'm doing those things, just quite organically on an individual, sort of organizational and then societal level, um, yeah, I feel like it will get us somewhere. And it reminds me of a quote, and I wanted to read this by Desmond Tutu. And again, I can't remember if I've shared this. It's one of my favorite ones, and it says, "Do your little bit of good wherever you are in the world. It's those little bits of good that put together overwhelm the world."
Mm. Beautiful. I cannot end with anything better. Thank you so much. That
Thank
was
you.
incredible. Be blessed. And yeah, for those watching, we'll see you next time.
Our next convo. Bye.